Hey everyone, I want to welcome you back to another episode of Grace, Grit, and Grounds. So grab a cup of coffee and let's have a conversation. Today I wanted to touch on a topic that I think is very timely and needed in our culture and in our churches today. The topic is called toxic Christianity. I know that term has been thrown around quite a bit, but the reality is that there is some truth behind that slur. If you've spent any time in church, then you've probably had the opportunity to see the best and the worst of people. I know I have. In fact, I would love to invite you to drop into the comment sections if you're watching this now and just answer the question. What's the hardest church hurt that you've experienced? I think it's important that we share our stories because all of our stories matter. So I encourage you, drop it in the comments. Church hurt is something that is real. In fact, statistics bear this out. Uh, from what I can tell, over 120 pastors leave the pastorate every year or more. This is probably just in the evangelical and Protestant world. I'm sure that if we expanded out to the broader church world, we would see even higher numbers. These men are leaving not due to retirement or death. But there's another study that I think is even more telling. It says that over 42% of all pastors have considered just walking away from it, quitting full-time ministry altogether. Over 60% have doubted their calling. And of that 60%, many of them are sitting in their offices on Mondays asking if it's really worth it. That's just the pastorate world. If it's tough there, it's even tougher in other areas. In fact, I was looking up some basic numbers before I started this episode, and I came up with over the last 25 years, 40 million Americans have left the church. Just left, walked away. Most of the people that have left because of hurt, disillusionment, negative experiences with leadership. They're walking away wounded, and some of them never come back into the building again. They feel called to serve God. They feel like they want to express their faith, but every Christian they've ever known has hurt them or forgotten them or has never really connected to them after this hurt began. This is something that I think is important to note because over 4,000 churches a year are closed. And they're being closed because people are walking away. So much so that some people just never really get connected ever after high school and after they leave mom and dad's house. Last week we had an espresso shot where we talked to Trevor, our college minister here, and we discussed the vital need of having campus ministry. And I think it is vital because that's the demographic of people that are now 1 and 2 generations away from ever being in church. And if his numbers are correct, where he's saying 95% of the people on college campuses, for the most part, are lost, that's pretty telling. And I think a lot of that stems at some place with the concept of church hurt. This is something I think is important. As we talk about detoxing, in our culture, it can range from a variety of things. I know in the times past when I've tried to lose weight or gone through one diet after another, there has always been some form of detox that was necessary. I remember the first time I ever tried the carb-free diet. This was back in about 97, I think 98. And I didn't have any books on it. There wasn't a whole lot of websites back then because the internet was still in its infancy. And there really wasn't many good books out there. I know there was a book by the fella Atkins and a couple others, but there just wasn't a lot of good information out there. And even worse, there wasn't any good supplements like we have nowadays. Like you can go to the store now and find easily any of those carb-free, sugar-free supplements to be able to add to your diet. I just went cold turkey and didn't eat sugar anymore. And within 3 days, I was going through some of the worst pains in my joints and my back. I was having massive headaches. I couldn't go on. It took 3 days. And at the end of those 3 days, I felt like I was going to die. And all I did was cut out sugar, just sugar. Well, all forms of sugar, carbohydrates too. And it was so bad that I ended up going down to the cafeteria of the place that I was working, and I ordered a big slice of Hershey's cream pie, and I ate that, and within minutes, my body felt normal again. The headache disappeared. My bones, my joints, my muscles, everything that had been aching was gone away. I didn't succeed in detoxing from sugar. I did try it again later in life when I was went through another round of dieting, trying to lose some weight, and I was far more successful that time because I was prepared for it. I knew that the pain was going to come, so I went ahead and took steps to minimize that pain and be able to step down from the sugar and eventually get off of it for a couple years. And it was very good for me, and I appreciated that. But we're going to talk about something else a little bit different. We're talking about that toxic Christianity and how to detox our souls from that. And what I mean by toxic Christianity, and it takes a variety of forms, and I'm going to use some words that were probably buzzwords in the Christian community. So if I use a word that you don't understand, feel free to drop a message in the comments, and I'll be happy to explain it better if you want me to. The first one is basically legalism. Everybody knows that's been in church for any length of time knows about legalism, and we all talk about not wanting it in our lives, but oftentimes many of us find ourselves falling into that trap in one time or another. It's easy to do because there are rules. And the nice thing about rules, the nice thing about having those guidelines in the rules is that we know where we stand. And we can look to our left or our right, we can look behind us, so we can measure ourselves by a standard we can understand and we can evaluate, rather than using that standard being Jesus, which is perfect. We use instead a much lower standard where we keep the rules, we follow the rules, and we disdain anybody else that doesn't. Of course, we don't follow all the rules. We just follow the ones that are important to us, the ones that we've earmarked that we think is the appropriate level of rule following for us to be seen as the kind of Christian that we want to be seen. And in the end, what we're saying and through legalism, is that the rules matter more than people. And obviously, I don't think that's correct. Spiritual abuse. There is the very real situation of people that use their positions of authority to abuse their followers. Now, I use that word abuse, and it has a lot of connotations. Instantly, our minds go to some of the worst examples of that. But you don't have to go to the worst examples to see spiritual abuse. I've seen it in congregations and churches where leaders just refuse to listen to their followers when they talk about their concerns. I think I've probably been guilty of this a time or two myself. We start off thinking, well, we know best. Well, I've been to seminary. I know the Bible better than most people. My opinions in this probably count a little bit higher than the other person. Before you know it, we're saying that we know better than everyone else. And that's not true. We at times may have better plans, better pathways. We may have the opportunity to have a better guide, but we should never use that position of leadership in a way to use that fear or shame or whatever else to control the people that are following our leadership. Of course, there's hypocrisy. We all know about that. We all know what it's like. In fact, I can honestly say that almost everybody that's watching this can at least think of one or two people beyond a shadow of a doubt that are hypocrites. And if you don't know somebody and you're fibbing to yourself, look at me. I'm a hypocrite. every single Christian that has ever walked into a building and sat in a pew and heard a sermon, preached a sermon, sang a song, or served a meal at one time or another in one form or fashion has been a hypocrite. The church is made of hypocrites. If you find a church that does not have a single hypocrite in it, do not join, do not attend, because you'll ruin their vibe. Because all of us, I feel like I can safely say this, all of us are hypocrites. And that's simply preaching love, but living from a place of pride. Performance-driven religion. Now, this is a big one. There are a lot of people out there that like to push this gospel of prosperity, name it, claim it. The idea that if you have enough faith, if you are doing the right things, if you are in the right position, if you are striving for the kingdom and doing the very best, that you are going to be blessed more than everybody else. And that's frankly not true. God chooses who he blesses and who he doesn't. And it's his choice, not ours. One of the very best parables ever preached, which, by the way, if you haven't realized this yet, I love parables. I have spent my life studying the parables of Jesus. One of my favorite parables is the parable that Jesus gave of the workers, where the landowner needed to get the fruit in. And I've talked about this in the past. And he went in the morning, hired a bunch of workers, realized about midday that he didn't have enough workers for the work to do. So he goes out and hires another group of workers at midday. And about an hour or two before the day is over with, he still had more that had to get in. So he goes out and hires even more. And at the end of the day, he pays everybody the same wage, whether they work for 2 hours or 4 hours or for the whole day. And that irritates the people that were there the whole day, because in the back of their mind, I know they're thinking this because I would have thought it the same way. I could have held out, not worked at all, showed up at last minute, and got paid the same. I wasted my time working when I could have been having fun and just came to work at the very last minute. That's the wrong way to think. It just is. We should be grateful for every blessing we have, whether we've been working in Christianity for 30, 40, 50 years, or whether we just got saved yesterday. It doesn't matter when we came to the Lord. It matters afterwards. And our heart. Are we in a position of obedience? Are we willing to continue to do what God's called us to do? Or are we spreading a level of toxicity and hypocrisy to the world? I think right now we just have to clarify some things. The problem in all of this is not Jesus. He's the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow. The problem is when people use his name and then twist his teachings to push their own personal agendas. That's idolatry. That's sin. That's wrong. Jesus called out the Pharisees when he talked about whitewashed tombs. He said, you are beautiful on the outside, and inside you're filled with dead men's bones. Jesus flipped the tables, not once, but twice. Once the beginning of John and once the Passion. He did it for a reason, because they were there for the wrong reason. They were in his house, his Father's house, for the wrong reasons. They were focused on material gain, worldly conduct, and the letter of the law, instead of the people that they were sent to minister and worship with. So we're going to be dealing with this. Even in the Old Testament, there were issues. This is not a new problem. In fact, in Ezekiel chapter 34, God actually comes down heavy on the shepherds that he assigned, he called, he put into positions of authority. And they used those positions to not just disrupt the sheep or empower themselves, but they actually use their position to destroy the flock. Now, there's a process to the detox, and the process is pretty simple. The beginning is you have to name it. You've got to call it out. I remember when I was younger and I had interesting conversations with my mother, and my mother was often one to have sparks of wisdom where she would drop them out and just walk away and not even realize it. One of her favorites was name the game, don't play the game. So in that case, you have to name it. You have to call the hurt out and be honest with it. Because until you're honest with that hurt, until you're honest with what's happened in your heart, in your soul, in your life, you can never move on. That hurt will just continue to fester and grow, just like a splinter that gets under your skin. You keep waiting for it to come out, but sometimes it doesn't. A lot of times it doesn't. A lot of times it just gets festering and nasty. That's the first thing you need to do. After you name it, you have to release it. That's easier said than done. It's easier said to just release it than it is to actually go through the process to grieve and to let what was lost or broken go. But there has to be a time of mourning and grief. And the last thing is you have to replace it. You have to rebuild with God, with His truth, His grace, and His mercy from the ground up. And sometimes that's a process. That's kind of the reason why I wrote a book about it. In fact, we're getting ready to start a sermon series about toxic Christianity, as I mentioned, and I have a devotional that goes along with it. The devotional is titled Detox because healing takes honesty, time, and God's relentless grace. And it's a 30-day sort of devotional. It's intended to pair with the sermons that I'm going to be delivering, but it doesn't have to be. And I would encourage you, if you don't have a church home, if you're not watching anywhere online, you can always tune into our broadcasts on Facebook every week. I'll drop a link in the comments if you are so inclined. And over the next several weeks, we're going to be talking about the different, different types of church hurt, different types of toxic Christianity, and how we as Christians should respond to that. But part of it is owning it. Part of it is naming it, and then going through the grieving process to release it, and then to find a way to replace it with something that's healthy, which is something that will be designed to make us whole. Now, honestly, I could go through dozens of stories, not just of what have happened to me in church life, but in many of the folks that I've ministered to over the years. I have a very good friend, had a good friend. He passed away during COVID. His name is John Casola. John Casola was a friend of mine in Belgium. He was an American. He married a beautiful Belgian woman. They both came down with COVID. I think they both passed away. And he was a really good friend. He had been a pastor in Belgium for a very long time. And I met him because I was an American and he was too. And he had nowhere else to turn. He had been serving as an associate pastor in a church that was a little different than my own ministry context. As you know, I'm from a Baptist context. He was more from a Pentecostal holiness background, and we just became friends. And he was sharing with me that he had nowhere to go. He and his wife had been serving as associate pastors in this congregation in Brussels, and he was living in the church. They had an apartment set aside for him and his wife, and they went out shopping one day. They had their groceries in their hands. They came home, and the locks had been changed in the couple hours that they were gone. And one of the members of the church was standing out front telling them they no longer had a place to live and that their belongings would be boxed up and sent wherever they wanted them. Thank you and goodbye. Now, I don't know if I ever got the full story, and I don't care. I don't know if he did something or said something that the other pastor didn't like. I don't know if he was causing division there. I don't believe that was happening. I know him, and I got to know him over the next several years, and I don't think that was in his personality. I knew the other pastor, and I know what his personality was like. And so some of his story rings true, but I don't know. I just know that a man and his wife came to my church hurting. They were ready to give up ministry, and he was so very close to walking away from church and never setting foot in a church building again. He was in pain, deep pain. And I remember meeting with him, and I remember talking with him about the experience that they had. And I remember the tears that he wept because he had spent his entire life studying. He'd given up everything. He was a Vietnam vet. He met a Belgian woman when he was stationed in Europe near the end of the war, got married, began a life here, felt called into the ministry, started serving as best he could. He just wanted to he just wanted to serve his God. And he shared with me that this was not the first time that he had been through something like this. He had been hurt multiple times. And he said to me, "Al, this is the last straw. I can't go through this again." By this time, they had managed to find housing with the Belgian Housing Authority, and so they were living in the state subsidized apartments. They didn't have a lot. We were helping them with food, some other things just to get them on their feet and trying to do our best. And for 2 years, he slowly started attending services more and more. His wife still wouldn't come. And he began to go through the stages of healing. I remember when his wife started coming again. I remember the tears that she wept when she sat through a service and heard the singing, was able to enjoy the preaching, and for the first time felt like she was at home in a congregation. Now the church there was a different mix. It was an expatriate church where we had folks from all different nations. We were outside of a NATO base, and there are 26 or 27 nations in NATO, and they almost all of them had representation there at the base. Every Sunday morning, we had anywhere between 5 to 10 different nations represented. There was a large number of Americans, but for the most part, it was a very odd, eclectic group, and we weren't defined by denomination either. We said we were International Baptist, but I think there were some services where I was the only Baptist in the building. My wife herself will be the first one to say she's not Baptist by birth. She's Baptist by marriage. She considers herself a little more Baptist-costal than anything. And it was just an interesting group of individuals. All of us were displaced. Most of us didn't have family living in the area, and most of us just were looking for that community and connection. And it was just a neat place to be. I've never had another ministry like that, and I don't think I ever will. It was a beautiful time in our life, and being able to experience church, I think the way that God really intended, apart from those denominational distinctions and more focused on what the Bible actually had to say. And it was just a beautiful group of people. And he found a place to heal. And I remember about 3.5 years into his healing, we had just gone through a transition in the church because every 3 years, the military guys and gals would transition out, and we would have to transition with new leadership, and we were just going through that, and he was watching as I was navigating this, and he was giving me a little advice, and I was taking it. Some of his advice was really good, some of it, he just had never experienced life in a church like this, and we were just we bonded, we were good friends, and I remember him talking to me about the change, and I remember him saying that he still felt like he had work to do, and I asked him what that meant, and he said, I don't know." And I said, "Well, pray about it, and if the Lord gives you an answer, let me know." A couple weeks later, he came back, and he said, "Al, I've been praying about that." I said, "So have I." And he said, "Well, what has the Lord said to you?" And I said, "I'm not getting an answer. I'm just getting a sense of peace." Because the reality is, God wasn't gonna give me an answer about his ministry. God was gonna give him an answer about his ministry, and I was just there to be an encourager. I was there to be Barnabas. And he said to me finally that God hasn't taken his calling away, that he's still meant to be pastor. And I said, I think you're right. And I said, "So what are we gonna do about that?" He said, "I don't know." And I said, "Well, pray about it. Come back and let me know." He did. I did. And he came back. And he said, "I feel like God's calling me to start a Bible study in our projects. We have a lot of families there that have gone through the same type of church hurt that I have. These are people that are on the lower end of the Belgian society." He called them the down and outs, but they're just people that were struggling day to day to live. And he had had a connection with them. And I said, "John, what can I do to help?" And he said, "I don't know." I said, "Well, go home and pray about it. Let me know." And over the next year or so, we were able to put together a plan to launch a Bible study and eventually a house church and eventually an actual church where they started meeting on a regular basis and people started coming and the church started to grow. It was local national Belgians. They were preaching the word in French and they were enjoying the fellowship that God intended. And I was so overjoyed that our church, that little tiny church in Belgium, had an opportunity to partner with them. We did it financially. We did it with material goods. We gave them pulpit. We gave them tables and chairs and food and things that they needed. We helped subsidize it with helping to pay a salary for a season for the pastor. It was a beautiful time. And it reminded me then, as it does now, that the church as a whole may be broken, but Jesus is still beautiful. He is still whole, and he is still here wanting to bring that healing to those that are looking for it. Now, I'd like to say that that was the only example of that, but I can tell you this as I live and breathe. In every single church that I've ever pastored, including the one I'm pastoring now, there has been a level of healing that is needed to take place by church people, church pastors, and church workers that have needed a place that they could truly just find a measure of healing and a place to serve without judgment. And in every single church that I have pastored, I've been able to help provide through the Holy Spirit's guidance a place for people like that. That's tough. I could tell you story after story of experiences that I've had in the ministry. I've had one of my sons being choked out by a deacon, and I didn't find out about it until a month later because my son didn't want me to know because he was afraid that I would do something foolish and get fired. I've had people accuse my children of crimes, if you will, of stealing snacks and breaking furniture when they didn't do it, just because my kids tend to be in church a lot because I'm in the building a lot and I bring my kids with me, especially when I was there that age. It's been hard as a pastor and for my children growing up seeing, again, the best and the worst in church members. That's just the nature of it. So I ask again, what's the hardest part of the church hurt that you might have faced? What's keeping you from going back into the building? What would it look like if you were able to go through the steps to detox from that toxicness and find a place where you can worship again? We're all broken. We're all hypocrites. We all have experienced church hurt on one way or another. Question is, what do we do with those hurts? Do we hold them in? Do we let them fester? Or do we grieve them, put them in the ground and bury them deep and rebuild over the ruins something that looks a little bit more like Jesus? It's kind of where I am now. I want to see the church be more of a mobile spiritual hospital that's constantly moving where the hurt is and helping those that are in need and providing a place without judgment for people to come in the building, find the healing they need, and move to a place of health where they can truly worship and truly serve. In closing, I want you to know that if you're in a toxic space, if you're in a place that you don't know what to do, and you don't know if you should stay or leave, I can't say exactly what you should do in that way. But I can tell you this, that there's going to be freedom found in healing, whether you stay or leave. I would encourage you to seek that type of healing. Reach out to me through direct messenger or one of the other electronic forms, and I'll do what I can to help. I'll hear your story. I won't judge. I've been there. Truth is, toxic Christianity leaves scars, but God's love brings healing. But I'll be honest, those scars never really go away. They may fade over time, but they will never leave. Detox isn't about walking away so much from the faith as it is walking closer to Jesus and finding the healing that he offers. This is what we're talking about today. Toxic Christianity. We'll probably talk about this a little bit more. But as our time comes to an end, if anything that I've said today resonates with you, if anything that I have shared speaks to a place of truth in your life, I would encourage you to subscribe, to like this podcast, to even follow it so that you can be up to date whenever we put out a new episode. And I would encourage you to send this to somebody that you know is in need, somebody that might be able to hear some of the things that we've said. So until next time, I would encourage you, keep the coffee hot, keep the faith real, and keep the conversation going. And remember always that Jesus came not to burden you, but to set you free. Until next week.